On November 30th, 1939, a Soviet officer named Andrei Zelentsov led his 163rd Rifle Division across the Finnish border in the gray half-light of a subarctic morning, marching toward a logging town of about 4,000 people that almost none of his soldiers had ever heard of. Behind him, a second full division was already being fed into the same stretch of wilderness. The town was called Suomussalmi, and on the Soviet battle plan, it was nothing more than a waypoint. Take it. Keep walking west, reach the city of Oulu, and Finland would be cut cleanly into two separate countries. Soviet High Command expected the whole operation to take days. Some units marched without snow camouflage or proper winter boots, and at least one division brought along a full military band, instruments and all, for the victory parade everyone assumed was coming. What actually waited for them over the next 5 weeks was one of the most complete tactical destructions of the entire Second World War. Two Soviet rifle divisions, tens of thousands of men backed by tanks and artillery, would be cut into pieces along a single dirt road through the forest and erased from the order of battle. And the man who built the trap was a peacetime colonel who hadn't led troops in actual combat in over 20 years and had spent most of that time in a courtroom and a city council chamber, not on a battlefield. So how did roughly 11,000 Finnish reservists, mostly hunters, lumberjacks, and farmers on skis, manage to destroy two divisions of one of the largest armies on Earth in the coldest winter Europe had seen in a generation? To understand why this shouldn't have been possible, you have to understand how one-sided the war looked on paper. The Soviet Union had a population well north of 100 million and invaded on November 30th with roughly 500,000 troops. Finland had about 3.7 million people and an army built mostly from reservists who had been farmers, fishermen, and shopkeepers a few weeks earlier. Stalin wanted a security buffer around Leningrad. Finland refused to hand over the territory he demanded, and the Red Army crossed the border expecting the whole affair to be finished before the rest of Europe, distracted by a much bigger war against Germany, even noticed. The main Soviet effort slammed into the fortified Mannerheim Line in the south, but a second thrust, built around two full rifle divisions of the Soviet Ninth Army, was sent into the empty central wilderness of Kainuu province, with orders to walk through the forest, take Suomussalmi, and keep going until the country split in half. The man Finland sent to stop them was Colonel Jalmar Siilasvuo, and almost nothing about his career suggested he was the right man for the job. Orphaned at 12 and raised by relatives, he trained as a lawyer in Helsinki before secretly slipping off to Germany as a young man to join the Jaeger movement, a group of Finnish nationalists who trained as light infantry with the goal of eventually fighting for Finland's independence from Russia. He fought Russian troops on the Eastern Front in the First World War, came home to fight again in Finland's own civil war in 1918, and then spent the next 2 decades away from any battlefield. A desk posting at the Ministry of Defense, peacetime command of a home front brigade, and a military district, a seat on the Oulu City Council. When Field Marshal Mannerheim recalled him to lead a scrambled brigade-sized force into the Suomussalmi wilderness, Siilasvuo hadn't commanded troops in actual combat since the Civil War, more than 20 years earlier. What he understood immediately, and what the Soviet commanders across from him never grasped at all, was exactly what kind of army he actually had. His force, which would grow to about 11,000 men and get reorganized as the 9th Division, was not a professional fighting force. It was hunters, lumberjacks, and farmers from the Kainuu region who had spent their entire lives on skis in exactly this kind of terrain. They had almost no artillery, almost no anti-tank weapons, and no tents built for real winter. What they had was mobility, patience, and a tolerance for cold that would eventually drop to nearly 40 degrees. Siilasvuo never tried to turn these men into a conventional division that could trade volleys with Soviet tanks in the open. He built his entire campaign around the one advantage they actually had. That advantage came down to a single Finnish word, Motti. It means a stacked bundle of logs cut into sections and ready for the axe, and it became the name for the tactic that would erase 2 Soviet divisions. Picture the map of Kainuu from above. It's almost entirely forest, frozen swamp, and lake cut through by a handful of narrow single-lane logging trails, barely wide enough for 2 trucks to pass each other. Soviet divisions were mechanized, tanks, artillery, and supply columns that could only move on those trails. The moment a division committed to one of those roads, it had no choice but to stretch out into a column miles long, nose to tail, unable to leave the road, and often unable to even turn around on it. The Finns had no such restriction, moving fast on skis and white camouflage capes, nearly invisible against the snow, while Soviet tanks sat painted in dark olive drab and Soviet infantry marched in plain khaki. Finnish squads could vanish into the tree line and reappear 50 yards from a column that had no idea they were there. They cut the road at multiple points with felled trees, roadblocks, and mines, slicing one long column into isolated segments, cut off from fuel, food, ammunition, and each other. Each Motti became its own private siege. The Finns never needed to win one decisive battle. They needed only to keep cutting, keep raiding at night, and let the cold and hunger finish whatever the ambushes started. The 163rd Division was the first to walk into it. Zelentsov's men took Suomussalmi village on December 7th after brushing aside a single understrength Finnish battalion, and for a few days the Soviet plan looked like it was working exactly as designed. Then Siilasvuo's regiment arrived, and instead of trying to retake the town in a straight assault the Red Army could have won on firepower alone, he went after the roads instead. On December 11th, his troops cut the southern supply route back to the Soviet border. 2 days later, they severed the northern route as well, leaving the entire 163rd Division dependent on one improvised crossing over a frozen lake for everything it needed to survive. For 2 weeks, the noose simply tightened while more Finnish troops and a handful of artillery pieces quietly moved into position. Zelentsov tried to break out to the south on December 24th. It failed. He tried again to the west on December 25th. That failed too. On December 27th, Siilasvuo hit the town from several directions at once. And the Soviet line didn't bend. It broke completely. What followed wasn't a retreat. It was a stampede across the frozen surface of Lake Kiantajärvi, with men going through the ice or freezing to death in the open as they ran. Within 4 weeks, a Soviet rifle division that had crossed the border with tanks and cavalry support had ceased to exist as a fighting force. While the 163rd was being ground down, the Soviet 44th Rifle Division had already been ordered west along a different route, the Raate Road, to punch through and relieve them. Nobody expected this one to fail. It was one of the Red Army's older, more storied formations. A mostly Ukrainian division with roots back to the Russian Civil War, fully equipped with tanks, trucks, and artillery. And its officers were confident enough in the outcome that the division brought along a full military band for the parade they assumed was coming. Its commander, Alexei Vinogradov, was a career officer who had risen quickly through the ranks in the late 1930s, exactly the years Stalin's purges were thinning out the Soviet officer corps and pushing men upward faster than their experience warranted. Now picture the situation from Vinogradov's position. Somewhere to his west, the 163rd Division was being systematically dismantled, close enough that his own men could hear the artillery. He made no serious attempt to break through and save them. Instead, on December 28th, he ordered his division to dig in defensively along the Raate Road, a single-lane forest track that left his roughly 18,000 men strung out over more than 20 miles, chained to a column of vehicles that could not leave the road and could barely turn around on it. It was, without anyone on the Soviet side realizing it, the same trap the 163rd had just been destroyed in, except bigger. Once the 163rd was finished, Siilasvuo turned his whole division loose on the 44th, running the identical playbook at a much larger scale. Finnish squads cut the Raate Road into segments with roadblocks, mines, and felled timber, isolating pocket after pocket of Soviet troops from resupply and from one another. Tanks that tried to smash through the blockades were picked off at close range by small teams working in the dark. Soldiers without real winter gear started losing fingers and toes to frostbite, while their food and ammunition sat trapped in trucks a few hundred yards up a road they no longer controlled. Finnish patrols went after the field kitchen specifically on the simple logic that a division that can't eat breaks faster than a division that can't shoot. Night after night through the first week of January 1940, Finnish patrols struck the column and pulled back into the trees, leaving frostbite and starvation to finish what each raid had started. By January 6th, radio contact between the 44th Division and Soviet headquarters had been severed completely, and Vinogradov, finally free to act on his own judgment, ordered a retreat east toward the border. It came far too late to be orderly. The withdrawal collapsed into a full stampede across the ice of Lake Kianajärvi, the same lake that had swallowed so much of the 163rd Division days earlier. And in the final chaos, more Soviet soldiers went into the freezing water than fell to Finnish rifles. By January 7th, the Raate Road had gone silent. An elite division that marched in with its own band now barely existed at all. The numbers coming out of Suomussalmi are the kind military historians still argue about, mostly because it's hard to believe any version of them. Estimates for Soviet dead, wounded, and missing across both divisions combined range from roughly 22,000 to well over 27,000 men. Soviet officials at the time claimed publicly that their losses on the Raate Road were only a few hundred, mostly from frostbite, not from the Finns. Finnish losses across the entire 5-week campaign totaled around 900 killed and 1,200 wounded. Siilasvuo's men walked away from the wreckage with 85 captured tanks, more than 400 trucks, over 1,600 horses, dozens of artillery pieces, more than 6,000 rifles, and in a detail that's hard to script better than reality already did, the instruments belonging to the 44th Division's own band. For Vinogradov, the reckoning came fast, and it came in front of an audience. Soviet High Command sent an investigator to find someone to blame, and settled on Vinogradov within days. He was arrested, given a summary court-martial, and formally charged on the official record with the loss of 55 field kitchens. On January 11, 1940, he was executed by firing squad in front of the surviving men of his own division, alongside his chief of staff, Volkov, and his political officer, Pahomov. Moscow's response to the whole disaster was to get angrier, not smarter. Stalin, by most accounts, was deeply displeased with how badly the campaign had damaged Soviet prestige, especially since the League of Nations had already voted to expel the USSR over the invasion. Within weeks, Soviet strategy quietly shifted away from conquering all of Finland and towards simply forcing the Finns to the negotiating table. A war that finally ended in March 1940, with Finland battered, smaller, but still independent. The real cost showed up a little over a year later. Stalin's purges had visibly hollowed out Soviet military leadership, and the Red Army's performance against a country a fraction of its size convinced Hitler that a fast, decisive invasion could actually work. A belief historians widely count among the factors behind his decision to launch Operation Barbarossa in 1941. A defense built out of lumberjacks and a part-time lawyer may have quietly helped talk Hitler into the biggest invasion in history. That same winter also left the world with a piece of vocabulary. Mocking Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov's claim that Red Air Force cluster bombs were actually food deliveries for starving Finns, Finnish soldiers started calling their homemade anti-tank petrol bombs Molotov cocktails, a joke that outlived Molotov, the war, and very nearly the century. Military historians reaching for a comparison to Suomussalmi usually skip past Kanai, the classic ancient encirclement, and go back further to the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, where Germanic tribes under a chieftain named Arminius wiped out 3 entire Roman legions using almost the same idea. Let a rigid professional army string itself out along a narrow route through terrain it doesn't understand, then cut it apart piece by piece before it can reorganize. Rome had never lost 3 legions in a single battle before Teutoburg. The Red Army had never lost 2 full divisions in 5 weeks before Suomussalmi. What makes the whole campaign remarkable is the same thing that made a similar ambush remarkable on a different continent in a different war more than a century and a half earlier. Siilasvuo never once tried to make his hunters and lumberjacks into something they weren't. He didn't dream up an anti-tank corps he had no equipment to build, or a mechanized counterattack his supply lines couldn't support. He looked honestly at what he actually had: men who could move silently through their own forests on skis, who could survive cold that was killing the enemy by the hundreds, and who had the patience to wait out a siege instead of forcing a battle. And he built 5 weeks of warfare entirely around those specific, unglamorous strengths. The Red Army never adjusted because its entire doctrine assumed overwhelming mechanized force would win by itself on any terrain against anyone. At Suomussalmi, that assumption walked into the woods and didn't come back out. The ground along the Raate Road is peaceful now. A memorial called Raatin Portti sits on that same stretch of forest, built around a field of more than 20,000 natural stones. roughly one for every estimated Soviet soldier who died there, with a set of wooden arches at its center holding 105 bells, one for every day the winter war lasted. That chime quietly whenever the wind moves through them. Standing in that forest today, it's easy to forget that for 5 weeks in the coldest winter in a generation, this quiet dirt road hosted one of the most lopsided defeats of the entire Second World War. If this story of tactical brilliance and survival in the frozen wilderness changed how you look at the forgotten corners of history, please subscribe and like the video. We are currently excavating the history that they tried to bury. Help us plant the seeds for the future. The next treasury of history will open soon.